Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jake, Vice President of Fundación Grupo Punta Cana, Grupo Punta Cana Foundation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are right now and a little bit of the history because it's entirely relevant to, let's see if I can get this to change. Maybe not. It's entirely relevant to this conference and what we're doing here. And some of our experience in developing public-private partnerships and a little bit about what you saw this morning related to the Southeastern Marine Reef Sanctuary. When our original property here in Punta Cana was founded, it was almost 50 years ago. It was a group of American investors found an undeveloped piece of land and decided that tourism was a good idea. They approached a local Dominican, who you saw this morning, Mr. Ranieri, who at the time was 23 years old. And he was really the first one that said Punta Cana, despite having no roads, no electricity, no airport, very little or isolated communities, and no hotel infrastructure whatsoever, might be a terrific place to build tourism. And when they approached the Dominican government, the government said, we're not interested, we're building in other parts of the country. And then they approved Punta Cana building a privately owned airport, which at the time was very unique. This was not something that was very common, and it was also something very small and insignificant. Obviously, that's not the case today. Most of you arrived to Punta Cana. It's still a privately owned international airport. We now get 3.5 million arriving passengers a year, and it's one of the busiest airports in the Caribbean. Well over 50% of all air traffic in the Dominican Republic comes through Punta Cana. And so that makes us very unique and very idiosyncratic in the sense that our property, our resort, is really small. We only have 200 hotel rooms. We have private luxury homes where generally people don't live year-round. We have a smaller residential community where there are people living year-round. And so we have a really unique relationship to our region. Places like Barceló, Iberostar, and all these other different hotels in the region are really what drive our success as a company. Because when you arrive at our airport, the likelihood is that you're not coming to our property as Grupo Punta Cana, you're going to someone else's hotel. And so we have a much bigger regional vision for sustainability, and we have a much more regional scale approach to how we look at water, how we look at waste, how we look at our coastal resources. And so this has led to us being a different type of steward of the destination. It's made Grupo Punta Cana much more concerned about the long-term health and well-being of the destination as opposed to really just thinking about our little slice of Punta Cana. And so that's translated into a lot of unique activities, and I'm going to concentrate specifically on what we do on the marine side. So what you saw this morning was a signature with the Ministry of Environment and the Tourism Cluster of Punta Cana. And the idea was that we currently have an agreement in place where we're planning, developing a management plan for the marine sanctuary in this area and implementing rules, regulations for fishing, for boaters, for hotels, and for different activities to ensure that this area is protected in the long term or restored in the cases where it's been degraded. So what we did this morning was commit the government to look at extending this marine sanctuary into this region and this northern part of the tourism destination. And so this is what the sanctuary looks like now. And in fact, when we became aware of the existence of this sanctuary, it was only a few months ago, about 5 months ago. And essentially what happened is we had been developing a management plan for the little slice of Punta Cana in front of our property, which is about 8 kilometers. And when we approached the government and said we would like some kind of formal authority to manage this area, they said, well, we would only be able to give you a formal authority if you did co-management for the entire sanctuary. And we said, what sanctuary? This was a sanctuary that was created in 2009 and really has not had any supervision, hasn't had any implementation of any protection. And so what we've done is looked at reasons why, as a company, it makes sense for us to invest in protecting the sanctuary and investing in coral reef protection and restoration. So when we look at things that were discussed, for example, at lunch or in other places, activities in terms of reasons why a company might invest in protecting reefs, has to do with risk mitigation, has to do with coral reefs protecting our assets, protecting our infrastructure, protecting our buildings, protecting our hotels and our private homes and our golf courses, and really figuring out ways how we can invest in protecting the coral reef. And coral reef for us is not just a theoretical concept. It's not something that we just think of as, you know, this beautiful space near our hotel. This is where our tourists go. This is what they do for recreational activities. This is what protects the beaches and creates the beaches that people come to visit in the region of Punta Cana. And so we think of things like parrotfish as being paramount to our resort community. They produce sand. They provide an attraction for local folks and for tourists to come and visit us, and diving activities. And so we think of this as part of our assets. And so we have a restoration program we've been undertaking for about 12 years or so, and we discovered the restoration activity can be quite successful in terms of outplanting endangered species of coral, like Acropora cervicornis, but it requires getting local actors involved and getting other people to help us do this labor-intensive work. In our region, we have a severe problem, similar to other places, with significant overfishing. And so we've figured out how can we get the tourism sector to integrate local fishermen and create alternative livelihoods. Local fishermen rely, generally speaking, on species such as parrotfish, which are paramount for our sand and our protection of our reefs. And so we've figured out ways that the local fishermen can assist in some of the activities that we're doing in terms of reef conservation. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, there are huge harvests of parrotfish. There's almost 50% of fish capture, for example, in Punta Cana is parrotfish. And so we have targeted local fishermen and trained them and dive certified for PADI dive certification and for a specialty dive certification, where we can hire them to help us do coral restoration work. So this encouraged us to continue working with fishermen in projects such as lionfish harvesting, where this invasive species is causing all kinds of problems for the local reefs. And we encouraged local fishermen to harvest lionfish so we could serve it in our restaurants. And then eventually we got local fishermen's wives to create different kinds of crafts that can be sold to also encourage the harvesting of lionfish. And so we found that the more we approached the fishermen and the more success we had incorporating them into different activities, the more we realized they had very unique capacities and skills that were useful to tourism. And as a tourism industry, we hadn't done a great job in engaging them. Now, when people say that fishermen are dependent on fishing for their livelihoods, in a region like Punta Cana, that might not be 100% true. We have close to 50,000 hotel rooms in the Punta Cana region. We have a huge amount of employment. We have people coming from all over the island looking for work. So it couldn't possibly be that there isn't work for fishermen. It's much more likely that we haven't done a good job of incorporating them. And so we've begun offering certifications for boat captains. So this is 18 local fishermen who recently did a fishing exam from the Navy of the Dominican Republic to become proficient in operating boats, so they could be hired by our aquatic centers regionally in Punta Cana. This is a group that's been now certified in PADI, underwater, open water diving. And so we found that as a group, as a tourism operation, that we could figure out unique ways to integrate these fishermen into the tourism economy, and we could have a different conversation with how the private sector interacts with the conservation of our coral reefs. So for example, this idea of resilience over climate change, when you approach a hotelier and you start scaring them about weather events or you start scaring them about hurricanes, generally they're not terribly receptive to that. But if you talk to them something about resilience, about their property being more quickly able to get back and operational after a storm, then that's something most hoteliers are more willing to listen to. We think that there needs to be a need for integrated approaches to managing our coastal ecosystems. In many places, hoteliers think essentially of how do I keep sand on my beach? And so if we can engage them in looking at coral reefs as part of a bigger ecosystem, if we can get them to think about waste management as part of a bigger ecosystem, it's much easier to engage them in other activities beyond simply beach mitigation, beach erosion mitigation. We think that donors can also engage the sleeping giant, which is what we call the private sector, is essentially this group that for many years has been approached as the wrongdoer, or the group that's been violating all these environmental rules, and causing environmental damage. And so when we approach the private sector, very often the conversation is, well, you're doing what's wrong, so you should pay to correct it. When in fact, very often the private sector, if they're engaged in the right way with the right language and there's unique funding mechanisms, then they're much more willing to invest their own resources into protection. And I think that comes back to a lot of those conversations that's been having about taxes. I think generally speaking, the private sector is not enthusiastic about taxes, in part because there's been such a poor use of these resources by the public sector that they're very often not very enthusiastic about paying additional taxes when the history of how those previous taxes have been used is not terribly encouraging. I think in our case, we've determined that fishermen can be an asset as opposed to a pest. I was at a conference just not long ago, and we were explaining some of the ways that we've engaged fishermen in tourism, and the comment was, you know, yes, they're a terrible pest because they're there and they're in the way and they're taking all the fish and they're affecting the coral reef. And we think that, you know, engaged in the right way, fishermen can actually contribute a lot to tourism. And then I think some of the ideas that are being explored in this conference that we can continue to put a value on reef ecosystems and other kind of coastal ecosystems so that the private sector can really try and engage in such a way that they understand that this is not simply a landscape that they've decided to deposit a hotel or private homes or a golf course, but rather these are part of their asset and there is a value to this resource. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jake.